Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you as well for the generous invitation. It's wonderful to be here, especially in this quite stunning space, and to be participating in the public intellectual life of Barcelona once again. The anthropologist Talal Asad recently wrote a book about suicide bombing. It is not a book that one can easily take on a plane, and the title itself raises all kinds of suspicions. Indeed, the title is simply Suicide Bombing, and so one does not know right away the author's view of this phenomenon. The term is unsettling, to say the least, but there it is, printed, bold, there. The question that drives the book is whether suicide bombing can be thought and what resources we need in order to think it. Perhaps this is not a surprising question, but perhaps it is. It is not surprising because suicide bombing is a social phenomenon and ought to be subject to social analysis like any other. But there is, for many, a resistance to analysis in this case, since readers want to know from the outset that Assad, a scholar with an Arabic name, is opposed to the practice. Of course, Assad knows this, which is why he will certainly, parenthetically, make clear that he is not endorsing the practice of suicide bombing. But he nevertheless wants us to defer this normative judgment of the practice in the name of understanding what it is, how it works, and mainly how it is construed within certain Western and liberal discourses. The reason he wants to defer the question of judgment is complex, but it certainly is not because he secretly wants us to celebrate the practice of suicide bombing. In a way, he is baiting us, seeing whether or not we can take the time to consider the phenomenon, to commit ourselves to a certain understanding before we move to judgment. In particular, he stops us at precisely the moment in which we have to consider the moral urgency of our own response. We want to be able to know where we are, to secure the judgment that he judges suicide bombing to be wrong. We don't want to have to think about this urgency because we consider it simply justified, simply right, because we are in the face of something simply unjustified and simply wrong. The task of understanding this response, though, is the one that the book delivers to us. In the course of his analysis, Assad tries to understand the horror that is felt in the face of suicide bombing, and he's able to outline many dimensions of this horror. But one question he poses is of interest to me here and offers a way into thinking about vulnerability, the topic that I propose to undertake this evening. He asks us why we feel horror and moral repulsion in the face of suicide bombing when we do not always feel the same horror and moral repulsion in the face of state-sponsored violence. He asks the question not in order to say that these violences are the same, or even to say that we ought to feel the same moral outrage in relation to both. But he finds it curious, and I follow him here, that our moral responses that first take form as affect, are tacitly regulated by certain kinds of interpretive frameworks. His thesis is that we feel more horror and moral aversion, revulsion, in the face of lives lost brutally under certain conditions and through certain means than through others. If someone is killed in war or someone kills in war and the war is state-sponsored, then we invest, and we invest the state with legitimacy, then we consider the death lamentable, sad, unfortunate, but not radically unjust. And yet, if violence is perpetrated by counterinsurgency groups regarded as illegitimate, then our affect invariably changes, or so Assad assumes. Of course, it is a problem to consider Who is this we who might be the one said to react to violence with moral revulsion in one circumstance, but not in the other? I confess to having some problems with the assumption of this we, since I am unclear whether Assad considers himself to belong to this we, and whether there is any clear way to delimit who belongs to the we and who does not. And I confess as well to being less than happy with recourse to the West. Where does that topos begin and end? And I'm not altogether clear about references to something called liberal democracy, which seems to me to name a number of political forms that more often than not honor the principles of liberal democracy in the breach. It seems clear, though, that he is saying something important about the politics of moral responsiveness, namely, that what we feel is in part conditioned by how we interpret the world around us, and that how we interpret what we feel actually can and does alter the feeling itself. This suggests that interpretation helps to build and alter affect. Affect is not one activity and interpretation another. I'm against Sontag in this regard, but rather, as much as our interpretations are motivated by emotions that may or may not be available to us, so those emotions can alter when we come to view them in new ways. I've always appreciated the distinction that some philosophers make between emotion and feeling. Feeling is available. Feeling is even defined by its availability to sense experience. But it could be that we have emotions that we do not feel, that they constitute a complex and less than conscious psychic formation. Some people have even argued that guilt is not a feeling, suggesting that it is a complex psychic displacement, a way of blocking feeling from registering at all. Yet others have suggested that guilt is indeed a feeling, but still a displacement from some other complex of emotions, such as grief or longing or even fear. For Melanie Klein, guilt can be understood as a psychic formation that is not commensurate with deeds done, but functions instead as a way of regulating survival and loss. It's important to note that her most complex writings on guilt and destructiveness take place in an essay entitled Love, Guilt, and Reparation that was published in 1937. Even though Kleinian analysis sometimes has a reputation for being worldless, without a world, for conceiving of the psyche as driven always and only by its own impulses, there is no reason to restrict a reading of Klein to a Kleinian protocol. Indeed, one may have to read Klein against herself to make her work available to a social and political analysis. I won't be doing that this evening, except in a very preliminary way. But I want to point out that it makes a difference that Klein is writing in 1937, as Nazism is starting to threaten Europe, as militarism is high, and as rampant anti-Semitism and plans for colonial expansion are emerging in fascist Germany. She is actively wondering, in 1937, what, if anything, checks the drive to destruction? What bonds, if any, can we call upon as we watch the increasing threat of war? What, if anything, makes us want to preserve rather than destroy another human life or set of lives? Now, she can certainly ask this question, as if the answer will be found within the psyche. But I think we have to find a way of rethinking the psyche as a relational phenomenon, as a relation to the world, indeed as a perpetual problem posed by that complex set of relationalities. It's interesting, for instance, that Klein writes excessively about destructiveness, but she does not write from the perspective of the subject who fears being destroyed, who knows that she is destructible, or who lives a certain vulnerability to destruction as part of ordinary life. If our affective and moral responses are conditioned by interpretive schemes, and I'm arguing that they are, And these schemes are part of the regulation of affect conducted within the operation of power and the field of the political, then we will need another framework for following what Klein has to tell us. But let us follow her logic for a moment and then return to the question of the regulation of affect, and in particular, the differential ways in which we experience and regard the vulnerability to destruction. Following Freud's reflection on criminality, where he suggests that guilt might precede and precipitate a misdeed, Klein argues that guilt may in fact be fully incommensurate with misdeeds. Freud actually writes in a small essay, Criminality from a Sense of Guilt, that when first feels guilty, and then afterwards commits the deed that will satisfy the guilty feeling, right? So guilt precedes the guilty act, okay? It's not always true, but it's sometimes true, okay? A misdeed may well exist, setting aside for the moment what we mean by that, what's a misdeed, but it's also possible to feel guilt simply in relation to destructive impulse, whether acted on or not. In this way, guilt operates as a prophylactic, checking the impulse that would destroy the object of love. Why would it be important to make sure the object of love is not destroyed? Klein's answer has nothing to do with the sanctity of human life or even the ethical demand for protection that another life imposes on us. Klein is not a Levinasian. Rather, without the object of love, the ego does not believe it can survive. The ego can survive. According to Klein, then, we seek to protect the other against our own violence in order to avert a crisis of survivability for ourselves. The psychoanalytic explanation seeks recourse to the literal dependence of the child on the adult caretaker, without whom the child cannot survive. But for the adult, that dependency lives on as the prospect of unsurvivable loss. In such a situation, if one loses the other, then one will no longer know who one is. One's very being, the prospect of surviving as one is, becomes unthinkable. This raises, of course, a question of ontology. Who am I, such that certain losses would seem to threaten me with my own survival? Am I bound to others in ways that makes my own survival alternately thinkable or unthinkable? Note that this is different from asking whether I am dependent, whether dependency is an attribute of who I am. It's different from asking whether I am vulnerable or have needs, as if vulnerability and needs were somehow characteristics of the self that I am. What is being described, even if Klein herself could not theorize it, is a set of relations without which there is no self. We would then have to rethink the self not as a bounded entity, but as something that is bound to others. As bound up with others, alternatively, bound and unbound, the self is a set of relations, is nothing outside those relations. And even in referring to itself, it is referring to nothing other than those set of relations that make survival possible. As you can see, we're not talking about a discrete and bounded self that is in a social world. There's not a self who is completely discrete and placed in a social world as if it's in an exterior space or container of some sense. We're talking rather about a sociality without which there can be no self-reference at all, without which I cannot say I. The term bound carries complex resonances here. If the self is bounded, it is discrete, defined by its boundary, and so defined precisely by what differentiates that self from others. If the self is bound to others, then it is in thrall, in relationship, and there is no in itself and no boundary that establishes the self as a discrete entity. Indeed, The self is always negotiating the loss of its discreteness, its boundary, and this is an invariable feature of its sociality. And though we might think in commonsensical ways that we will lose the self if we lose our boundary, most Americans feel that way for whatever reason, it is surely more fundamentally true that if we are unable to lose or loosen the boundary, we cannot live in relations with others, which means that we cannot live. To become bound up with others is to lose the boundary, and to lose the boundary is a condition of survival. The one who fails to lose that boundary, who remains pure boundary, pure defense, cannot be a self. This means that the self is not a bounded entity. But that the process through which the boundary is relinquished in relation to another, the boundary is relinquished as a relation to the other. That is inevitable. Now, I am aware that this way of thinking can be difficult to sustain. And I'm sure that one objection to what I'm suggesting is to say boundaries are necessary. And indeed they are. One cannot relinquish a boundary unless a boundary is already in place. So I am not describing a situation of absolute boundarylessness. On the contrary, I'm describing a displacement, even a dispossession, that is a condition of social life, which means that we have to think this process, this struggle, always in terms of place, of boundary, and of the other metaphors that ego psychology has inherited from the language of political sovereignty. I hope to bring this back to a question of politics and to show how this way of thinking about the body and vulnerability more generally implies a certain political vision on the far side of sovereignty. But I want to suggest as well, perhaps somewhat provocatively, that dispossession is a point of departure for thinking about vulnerability and moral obligation alike. This offers an alternative to conceptions of belonging and sameness that underwrite certain versions of the national subject. I am not trying to affirm the condition of being dispossessed of rights or the condition of being dispossessed of homes. These are radical injustices, but only to show that the social world, conceived as radical interdependency, forms the condition of possibility for making the claim to social justice, for making the claim to rights to health, home, protection, and freedom. We always make that claim within an existing sociality and by virtue of it. It is what we owe one another, and it is why, when we make such claims, we are appealing to one another for political change. Only through a dislocation of the first-person perspective do we come to understand something we might call social responsibility. The claims for shelter, for protection, for conditions of flourishing are all claims that are made to someone else, to another, invoking a certain radical dependency of each on all. In this sense, there is no political claim without this dispossession of the I as its condition of possibility. How do we begin to rethink the subject outside the boundary? And does this mean that the subject itself must become deconstituted in and through this conception of sociality? Many of the most profound political passions are centered on the question of boundaries and borders. Who may cross the border and who may not? Who crosses without warrant or justification? The flows of capital, the contests over immigration, and the practices of war all center on the question of when and how and why a border can be crossed. The perspective is one in which the permeability of the border represents a national threat, or indeed a threat to identity itself. Identity, however, is not thinkable without the permeable border, just as identity is not thinkable without the possibility of relinquishing boundary. In the one case, one fears invasion, encroachment, and impingement, and makes a territorial claim in the name of self-defense. But in the other case, a boundary is given up or overcome precisely in order to establish a certain connection beyond the claims of territory. The fear of survivability can attend either gesture, and if this is so, what does it tell us about survivability and vulnerability of this kind? Well, if Melanie Klein is right, we develop moral responses in reaction to questions of survivability. My wager is that Klein is right about that, even as she thwarts her own insight by insisting that it is the ego's survivability that is finally at issue. Why the ego? After all, if my survivability depends on a relation to others, to a you, or a set of yous without whom I cannot exist, then my existence is not mine alone, but is to be found outside myself in this set of relations that precede and exceed the boundaries of who I am. If I have a boundary at all, or if a boundary can be said to belong to me, then it is only because I have become separated from others, and it is only on the condition of this separation that I can relate to them at all. So the boundary is a function of the relation, a brokering of difference, a negotiation in which I am bound to you in my separateness. If I seek to preserve your life, then it is not only because I seek to preserve my own, but because who I am is nothing without your life. And the life itself has to be rethought as this complex, passionate, antagonistic, and necessary set of relations to others. I may lose this you and any number of particular others, and I may well survive those losses, but if I do, it is only because my life is nothing without the life that exceeds me, that references some indexical you without whom I cannot be. But before I move to this suggestion about how to think beyond the individual ego and the bounded body, let me return for a moment to what I think is right in what Klein has to offer. If guilt is linked to a fear over survivability, then it suggests that, as a moral response, it references a pre-moral set of fears and impulses tied up with destructiveness and its consequences. If guilt poses a question for the human subject, it is not first and foremost a question of whether I am leading the good life, but whether life will be livable at all. Whether conceived as emotion or feeling, guilt tells us something about how the process of moralization occurs and how it deflects from the crisis of survivability itself. If one feels guilt about the prospect of destroying the object, the other, to whom one is bound, the object of love and attachment, then it may be for reasons of self-preservation. If I destroy the other, then I destroy the one on whom I depend in order to survive, and so I threaten my own survival with my destructive act. If Klein is right, then, I probably don't care very much about the other person who I am about to destroy. That other person does not come into focus for me as another separate from me, who deserves to live and whose life depends on my ability to check my own destructiveness. I care about the survival of the other, according to the Kleinian analysis, only because I fear that I will not survive the loss of the other. The question of my own survival, a survival threatened by the loss of the other, suggests that who I am depends upon this other, that I have to understand my survival not as something that can be achieved separately from any other, but only in relation to another. For Klein, the question of survival precedes the question of morality. Indeed, it would seem that guilt does not index a moral relation to the other, but an unbridled desire for self-preservation. For Klein, I only want the other to survive so that I may survive. The other's instrumental to my own survival. Guilt, morality are simply the instrumental consequences of this desire for self-preservation, one that is threatened mainly by my own destructiveness. Now, one can see how this morally cynical and self-referential ego psychology is derived from this particular explanation. I fight my own destructiveness in order to preserve myself. Is there even another here at all? We might take the same kind of explanation, subject Klein to a Winnicottian formulation, and conclude instead that the I is invariably relational. If we take her point that destructiveness forms the problem for the human subject, this seems most acutely true in times of war. And it seems to me acutely true for those who are in a position of power to wage war, to become the subjects whose destructiveness threatens whole populations. So if I conduct a certain first world criticism of destructive impulse in this lecture, it will be precisely because I am a citizen of a country which systematically idealizes its own capacity for murder. I think it was in the latest version of the Bourne Supremacy films, but it might have been Rush Hour 2, I'm not sure, that two U.S., maybe somebody knows, two U.S. Undercover cops get into a taxi in Paris. And the taxi driver realizes they are Americans, and he expresses his enthusiastic interest in the impending American adventure. Along the way, he offers a keen ethnographic insight. Americans, he says, they kill people for no reason. Now, of course, sorry, it's not a good joke, but it's there. Now, of course, the US government does give all kinds of reasons for its killings, at the same time that it does not call those killings killings at all. But if I undertake an inquiry into this question of destructiveness, and if I turn toward the question of precariousness and vulnerability, then it is precisely because I think a certain dislocation of perspective is necessary for the rethinking of global politics. The notion of the subject produced by the recent wars conducted by the US, including its torture operations, is one in which the US subject seeks to produce itself as impermeable, to define itself as protected permanently against incursion, and as radically invulnerable to attack. Nationalism works in part through producing and sustaining a certain version of the subject. We can call it imaginary if we wish. But we have to remember that it is produced and sustained through powerful forms of media, and that what gives power to such versions of the subject is precisely the way in which they are able to render the subject's own destructiveness righteous and its own destructibility unthinkable. Right? So whoever it kills with justification, and it itself cannot be killed and is invulnerable to destruction. Now, the reasons for extending the claims to sovereignty on the part of the US are heightened in light of the attacks of September 11th, 2001. But let us remember that this is a country that extends its jurisdiction beyond its own borders, that suspends its constitutional obligations within its borders, and that understands itself as not bound by any number of international agreements. It shores up its rights of sovereign self-protection at the same time that it makes righteous incursions into other sovereignties, or in the case of Palestine, refuses to honor any principles of sovereignty at all. This schism between righteous destructiveness and unthinkable horror at the thought of its own destructibility, or those of its allies, constitutes a kind of unreasoned rift at the core of the subject of nationalism. The point is not to oppose destructiveness per se, to counter this split subject of US nationalism with a subject whose psyche wants only and always peace. The repression of destruction can only happen through destructive means, so there is no other way than to find ways of crafting and checking destructiveness, giving it a livable form. And the point is not precisely to rehabilitate a unified and coherent subject, but how do we understand what it might mean to be a subject who is constituted in or as its relations, whose survivability is a function and effect of its modes of relationality? So I'm trying to ask, what would this question look like if posed within the framework of global politics? It seems to me that we're not only then rethinking a theory of the subject, but also suggesting a different way of thinking about sociality, since there is no subject without this constitutive sociality, and no sociality without this problem of the subject. This insight becomes all the more important when we realize that certain hegemonic forms of interpreting the world have consequences for how we might actually come to feel about the world. If just or justified violence is enacted by states, and if unjustifiable violence is enacted by non-state actors, right? And this is the presumption that Talal Asad is calling into question in his book on suicide bombing, right? Justified violence is enacted by states, unjustifiable violence is enacted by non-state actors. Then we have a way of explaining why we approach certain forms of violence with horror and other forms of violence with the sense of acceptance or even righteousness and triumphalism. The affective responses seem to be primary, in need of no explanation, prior to the work of understanding and interpretation. We are, as it were, against interpretation in the moments in which we react with moral horror in the face of violence. But as long as we remain against interpretation in such moments, we will not be able to give an account of why the affect of horror is differentially experienced. And we will not only proceed on the basis of this unreason, but we will take this unreason as the sign of our commendable native moral sentiments, perhaps even our fundamental humanity, right? So we react with horror at the loss of lives in European cities or in the US, and that's an immediate affect. And yet the lives that are lost elsewhere because of war, but who fail to represent certain nation states based on principles of liberal democracy, don't always or don't easily provoke the same moral horror in us. So we cannot say that our affect of moral horror is before interpretation, because there is an interpretation at work already whose lives are worthy of protection and whose lives are not. That differential is already working to construct our basic, immediate affective response to destructiveness in war. Paradoxically, the unreasoned schism in our responsiveness makes it impossible to respond with the same horror to violence committed against all sorts of populations. In this way, if we take our moral horror to be a sign of our humanity, right, I respond to violence with moral horror, therefore I am humane, we fail to note that the humanity in question is in fact implicitly divided between those about whom we feel urgent and unreasoned concern and those whose lives and deaths simply do not touch us. How do we understand the regulatory power that creates this differential at the level of affective and moral responsiveness? Perhaps it's important to remember that responsibility, a word that surely has been exploited by those who are currently decimating the welfare state in the name of responsibilization, responsibility nevertheless requires responsiveness, and that responsiveness is not a merely subjective state, but a way of responding to what is before us. Although we might be tempted to say that responsiveness is an attribute of a subject, that person is responsive, that person is not responsive, this takes the subject as the ground and anchor of the analysis of affect. What if affect is, from the start, communicated from elsewhere? What if affect only and always arrives as an already interpreted bit of experience? This is Nietzsche's argument in The Will to Power. If this is true, it suggests that we have to consider the genealogies of interpretation, the normative frameworks that come to structure affective response. A response is always a response to a perceived state of the world, but what is it that allows some aspect of the world to become perceivable and another not? How do we reapproach this question of affective response and moral evaluation by considering those already operating evaluative frameworks according to which certain lives are regarded as livable, as worthy of protection, as worth fighting for, and others are unworthy of protection precisely because they are not quite lives according to the cultural norms that govern the perception of living beings? One might, for instance, believe in the sanctity of life or adhere to a general philosophy of nonviolence, one that opposes violent action of all kinds. But if certain lives are not perceivable as lives, and this would include sentient beings who are not human, then the moral prohibition against violence will only be selectively applied. The critique of violence must begin with the question of the representability of life itself. What allows a life to become visible, knowable, in its precariousness and its need for shelter? And what is it that keeps us from seeing or understanding certain lives in this way? The problem is one of the media at the most general level, since it is only under the condition that a life is perceivable, that it is mediated in some way, that it can be accorded a certain value. And it is only on the condition of certain embedded structures of valuation that a life can become perceivable at all. Now, to perceive a life is not quite the same as encountering a life as precarious. To encounter a life as precarious is not a raw encounter, one in which life is stripped bare of its usual interpretations, appearing to us outside of all relations of power. An ethical attitude does not arrive spontaneously once the usual interpretive frameworks are destroyed, and no pure moral conscience emerges once the shackles of everyday interpretation have been thrown off. On the contrary, it's only through a challenge to dominant media that certain kinds of lives become visible or knowable in their precariousness. It is not only or exclusively the visual apprehension of a life that forms a necessary precondition for an understanding of the precariousness of life. Another life is taken in through all the senses, if it is taken in at all. But if we consider the conditions that produce the differential according to which certain kinds of violence are sanctified and other kinds of violence are abhorred, the tacit interpretive scheme that divides worthy and unworthy lives works fundamentally through the senses, through differentiating the cry we can hear from the one we cannot, the sight we can see from the one we cannot, but also at the level of touch and smell. War takes place, and sustains its practices through acting on the senses, crafting them to apprehend the world selectively, deadening affect in response to certain images and sounds, and enlivening affective responses to others. This is why war works to undermine a sensate democracy, restricting what we can feel, disposing us to feel shock and outrage in the face of one expression of violence and righteous coldness in the face of another violence. To encounter the precariousness of another life, the senses have to be operative, which means that a struggle must be waged against those forces that seek to regulate affect in differential ways. The point is not a celebration of the full deregulation of affect, but rather to query the conditions of responsiveness through offering interpretive matrices for the understanding of war that question and oppose the dominant interpretations that not only act upon affect, but take form and become effective as affect itself. So then, if we consider the insight that our very survival depends not on the policing of a boundary, the strategy of a certain sovereign in relation to its territory, but in recognizing how we are bound up with others, then that leads us to reconsider the way in which we conceptualize the body in the field of politics. The boundary of the body is always under negotiation, and that negotiation takes place through specific kinds of norms. What precisely does this mean? Well, it means, first of all, that we have to think whether the body is rightly defined as a bounded kind of entity, and I've suggested it is not. What makes a body discrete is not an established morphology, as if we could identify certain bodily shapes or forms as paradigmatically human bodies. In fact, I am not at all sure we can identify a human form, nor do I think we need to. This view has implications for rethinking gender. There are no ideal gendered forms. For rethinking disability, there are no ideals of able-bodiedness that inform our idea of the human. Of racialization, to name just a few of the social processes that depend upon the reproduction of bodily norms. And as the critique of gender normativity, ableism, and racist perception have made clear, there is no singular human form. We can think about demarcating the human body through identifying its boundary, through what form it is bound, but that is to miss the very important fact that the body is, in certain ways, and even inevitably unbound in its acting, its receptivity, in its speech, its desire, and its mobility. The body is outside itself, in the world of others, in a space and time it does not control. And it not only exists in the vector of these relations, but as this very vector. In this sense, the body does not belong to itself. It exists in a condition of exposure, dependency, where it continually undergoes the displacement of its first-person perspective. It's only as a result of a certain grammatical accident that we come to treat the body as an entity, or that we come to refer, strangely, to my body. We might think that the body establishes this first-person perspective as my own, that I'm grounded here in this body, and that no one has this perspective on the world that I have. But the body is, in my view, the site where a certain dislocation of perspective takes place, since how I am encountered and how I am sustained depends fundamentally on the social and political networks in which this body lives. So the norms of gender through which I come to understand myself, or indeed my survivability, are not made by me alone. I am already in the hands of others when I try to take stock of who I am. It follows then that certain kinds of bodies will appear more precariously than others, depending on which versions of the body, of morphology in general, support or underwrite the idea of the human life that is worth protecting, sheltering, worth living, worth mourning. These normative frameworks establish in advance what life will be a life worth living, what life will be a life worth preserving, and what life will become worthy of being mourned. Such views of lives worth living, sheltering, and mourning pervade and implicitly justify contemporary war. Thus, we can ask the critical question: how are lives divided on the basis of which lives represent certain kinds of states, which lives represent threats to state-centered liberal democracy, such that war is righteously waged on behalf of some lives, as protecting some lives, and the destruction of other lives is righteously defended. Now, I've sought so far this evening to move from a conception of the ego, and indeed the body as a bounded entity, to a thinking of the self as a bodily form that is inevitably bound up with others. This has been a way of creating an alternative to ego psychology by showing that survival depends less on the established boundary to the self than to the constitutive sociality of the body. I've used this phrase, being bound up with others, but this is something I have sought to affirm. In the case of torture, however, we hear another resonance for what it means to be bound by others, since those forms of physical coercion are precisely the unwilled imposition of force on bodies, being bound, gagged, forcibly exposed, ritually humiliated. We might then ask what, if anything, accounts for the survivability of those whose physical vulnerability has been exploited in this way. I want to suggest that vulnerability is not, again, a feature of the subject, not an attribute of the ego, but rather the condition of the subject's deconstitution through sociality. This deconstitution is not itself an injury or a situation we might want to rectify, that one's body is never fully one's own, bounded and self-referential, is the condition of passionate encounter, of desire, of longing, and of those modes of address and addressability upon which the feeling of aliveness depends. But the entire world of unwilled contact also follows from the fact that the body finds its survivability in social space and time. This exposure or dispossession is precisely what is exploited in the case of unwilled coercion, constraint, physical injury, violence. In the time that remains, I'd like to consider this question of survivability under conditions of war by looking briefly at the recently published collection, Poems from Guantanamo, which include 22 poems that were able to survive the censorship of the US Department of Defense. These are poems that are written by incarcerated people in Guantanamo. In fact, most of the poems written by detainees in Guantanamo were either destroyed or confiscated, and certainly not allowed to pass to the lawyers and human rights workers who were able to put together this slim volume. There were apparently 25,000 lines of poetry written by Shaikh Abdurrahim Muslim Dost that were destroyed by military personnel. When the Pentagon gave its rationale for the destruction and censorship of this poetry, it claimed that poetry, and I quote, presents a special risk to national security because of its content and its format. Okay, I love that. It's the most beautiful case for the politics of poetry I've heard in a long time. One has to wonder what it is about the content and format of poetry that seems so incendiary. Could it be that the syntax or form of a poem is actually perceived as a threat to the security of the nation? Wouldn't that be great? Is it that the poems attest to the torture, that the poems are kind of evidence of torture and might be used against the US? Is it that the poems actively criticize the United States, especially its spurious claims to be a protector of peace, its irrational hatred of Islam? These claims could be made in editorials or in prose, so what is it about the poetry that seems particularly dangerous? There's one poem entitled Humiliated in the Shackles by Sami al-Hajj, who was tortured at US prisons in Bagram and Kandahar before being transferred to Guantanamo, where he now remains. Here are two stanzas from his poem. I was humiliated in the shackles. How can I now compose verses? How can I now write? After the shackles and after the shackles and the nights and the suffering and the tears, how can I write poetry? End quote. Now, Al-Hajj, in these lines, attests to being tortured and asks how he can form words, make poetry after such humiliation. And yet the very line in which he questions his ability to make poetry is its own poetry. So the line enacts what Al-Hajj cannot understand. He writes the poem, but the poem can do no more than openly query the condition of its own possibility. How does a body tortured form such words? He is also asking how it can be that poetry can come from a tortured body and how the words emerge and survive. His words move from the condition of torture, a condition of coercion, to speech. Is this the same body that suffers torture and that forms the words on the page? Now, the forming of these words is linked with survival and the capacity to survive, or survivability. Let us remember that at the beginning of their detention, prisoners in Guantanamo would write short poems on styrofoam cups like this. These is exactly what they had, right? Because no glass, no metal, nothing. So they would write the poems with little pebbles into the side of the styrofoam cup, and they would pass the cup through the gate to the next prisoner in the next cell. Some of them would use small rocks or pebbles to engrave their words. The words were engraved on cups of this nature, not only cheap, indeed the very emblem of cheapness, but also soft, so that the prisoners would have no access to glass or ceramics, which could more easily be used as weapons. Sometimes toothpaste was used as the writing instrument. Apparently, they were later given paper and writing instruments as a sign of humane treatment, but these writings were, for the most part, destroyed. Right? So in the name of humane treatment, they give them something to write on. Here, have a piece of paper, have a pen, right? And then they take the writing and destroy it. Very humane. Very humane. Some of the writings are bitter political commentary. For instance, the opening poem by Shaker Abdurrahim Amir. Peace, they say. Peace of mind? Peace on earth? Peace of what kind? I see them talking, arguing, fighting. What kind of peace are they looking for? Why do they kill? What are they planning? Is it just talk? Why do they argue? Is it so simple to kill? Is this their plan? Yes, of course, they talk, they argue, they kill, they fight for peace. So it's with this perspicacious irony that Amer concludes that they fight for peace. But what marks this poem is the number of questions that he puts into poetic form, that he asks out loud, and the mix of horror and irony in the question at the center of the poem. Is it so simple to kill? Amer's poem moves between confusion, horror, and irony, and it concludes through the exposure of the hypocrisy of the US military and indeed the US government. His poem exposes the schism in the public rationality of his captors. They torture in the name of peace, they kill in the name of peace. Of course, we do not know what the content and format of the poems were that were censored, but this one seems to revolve around the repeated and open question on insistent horror, a drive toward exposure. Now, the unreasoned schism that structures the military field of affect is one which cannot explain its own horror in the face of the injury and loss of life by those populations representing the legitimate nation state and its righteous pleasure in seeing the humiliation and destruction of those populations that are not organized under the sign of the nation state. The lives of those at Guantanamo do not even count as the human lives protected by human rights discourse. The poems are themselves a different kind of moral responsiveness, a kind of interpretation, one that can, under certain conditions, contest and explode the dominant schisms that run through the national and military ideology. The poems constitute and convey the moral responsiveness toward a military rationale that has restricted moral responsiveness to violence in incoherent and unjust ways. Thus, we can ask, what affect is verbally conveyed by these poems, and what set of interpretations are delivered through these poems in the form of affect, including longing and rage? The overwhelming power of mourning, loss, and isolation becomes a poetic tool of counterinsurgency. Ustad Badruzaman Badr writes, and I quote, "The whirlpool of our tears is moving fast towards him. No one can endure the power of this flood." No one can endure, and yet these words arrive as tokens of an unfathomable endurance. In a poem called I Write My Hidden Longing, by Abdullah Majid al-Noaimi, each stanza is structured through the rhythm of suffering and appeal. My rib is broken, and I can find no one to heal me. My body is frail, and I can see no relief ahead. But perhaps most curious is the line in the middle of this poem, in which he writes, and I quote, "The tears of someone else's longing are affecting me. My chest cannot take the vastness of emotion. Whose longing is affecting the speaker? Is it the tears of someone else's longing, so that the tears seem not to be his own, or at least not exclusively his own? They belong to everyone in the camp, perhaps to someone else, but they impinge upon him, and he finds those other feelings within himself, suggesting that even in this most radical isolation, he feels what others feel. I do not know the syntax in the original Arabic, but in the English, my chest cannot take the vastness of emotion, suggests that the emotion is not his emotion alone, but a vastness or magnitude of emotion that originates with no one person. The tears of someone else's longing, he is, as it were, dispossessed by these tears that are in him, but are not exclusively his alone. So why read these poems? What do these poems tell us about vulnerability and survivability? They interrogate what kinds of utterances are possible at the limits of grief, of humiliation, longing, and rage. The words are carved in cups, are written on paper, are pushed onto a surface, an effort to leave a mark, a trace of a living being, even, I would say, a sign formed by a body, a sign that carries the life of a body. And even when what happens to a body is not fully survivable, which is the case in torture, the words survive to say as much. This is also poetry as evidence and as appeal, and each word is finally meant for another person. The cups are passed between the cells, the poems are smuggled out of the camp, they are appeals to an outside world. They are efforts to re-establish the sociality of the world, even when there is no concrete reason to think that any such connection is still possible. In the epilogue to this collection, Ariel Dorfman compares the writings of the Guantanamo poets to Chilean writers under the Pinochet regime. Although he is clearly mindful of the ways in which the poetry conveys the conditions of the camp, he calls attention to something else about the poems. And I think you can hear his words in Spanish on your what are these called? Ear things. Écouteur, I don't know what they are. Anyway, he writes, and I quote, "What I sense is that the ultimate source of these poems from Guantanamo is the simple, almost primeval arithmetic of breathing in and out. The origin of life and the origin of language and the origin of poetry are all there. In the first breath, each breath as if it were our first, the anima, the spirit which we inspire, what we expire, what separates us from extinction, minute after minute, what keeps us alive as we inhale and exhale the universe. And the written word is nothing more than the attempt to make that breath permanent and secure, carve it into rock, or mark it on paper, or sign it on a screen, so that its cadence will endure beyond us, outlast our breath. But once the breath is made into words, then the body is given over to another in the form of an appeal. In torture, the body's vulnerability to subjection is exploited. The fact of interdependency is abused. The body that exists in its exposure and proximity to others, to external force, to all that might subjugate and subdue it, is vulnerable to injury. Injury is the exploitation of that vulnerability. But this does not mean that vulnerability can be reduced to injurability. I think under conditions of torture, vulnerability is reduced to injurability. In these poems, the body is also what lives on, breathes, tries to carve its breath into stone. Its breathing is precarious. It can be stopped by the force of another's torture. But if this precarious status can become the condition of suffering, it also becomes the condition of responsiveness, of a formulation of affect, understood as a radical act of interpretation in the face of unwilled subjugation. In the poems, we hear the capacity to break through the dominant ideologies that rationalize war through recourse to righteous invocations of peace. The poem seeks to confound and expose the words of those who torture in the name of freedom and kill in the name of peace. In these poems, we hear the precarious cadences of solitariness. This tells us two separate truths about the body. As bodies, we are exposed to others, and this can be the condition of our desire, but also the possibility of a subjection to cruelty and subjugation. This follows from the fact that bodies are bound up with others through material needs, through touch, through language, through a set of relations without which we cannot survive. But to have one's survival bound up with others in such a way is a constant risk of sociality, its promise, and its threat. The very fact of being bound up with others establishes the possibility of being subjugated and exploited, though it does not at all determine what political form that will take. The very fact of being bound up with others establishes the possibility of being relieved of suffering, of knowing justice, and even love. The poems are full of longing. They sound the incarcerated body as it makes its appeal. Its breathing is impeded, but it continues to breathe. The appeal of the poem is an appeal to live, an instance and instrument of survival, but also to another sense of solidarity, of interconnected lives that carry on each other's words, suffer each other's tears, and form networks that pose an incendiary risk not only to national security, but to the forms of global sovereignty championed by the US. To say that the poems resist that sovereignty is not to say that the poems will alter the course of war or that they will ultimately prove more powerful than the military power of the state. I wish that were true, but I know it's not true. Still, the poems emerge from scenes of extraordinary vulnerability to subjugation, and nearly every poet remarks with astonishment that the words of poetry emerge from such a condition. But there they are, proofs of stubborn life, vulnerable, overwhelmed, their own and not their own, dispossessed, enraged, and perspicacious. These writings clearly articulate horror and anger in the face of an unjust military destructiveness. These are passionate acts of interpretation conveyed as language, exposing how the US military recasts wanton killing and torture as the righteous defense of peace and freedom. In this sense, the poems are critical acts of resistance, counterinsurgent interpretations, animated traces of lives, living and breathing words, incendiary acts that somehow incredulously live through the violence they oppose. Thank you very much.